In the early hours of April 1945, deep beneath the ruins of Berlin, Adolf Hitler sat in a concrete bunker as the Third Reich collapsed around him. The world remembers him as a dictator, a tyrant who bent millions to his will. Yet in those final moments, witnesses recalled something unsettling. The man who once commanded armies now listened, hesitated, and sought comfort not from generals, but from the women closest to him. This raises a disturbing question history long avoided. How much of Hitler's rise, rule, and ruin was shaped not only by ideology and war, but by the women who influenced, enabled, challenged, and sometimes controlled him? To understand Adolf Hitler, one must begin not with power, but with vulnerability. Born in 1889 in Austria, Hitler grew up under the shadow of a domineering father and an intensely devoted mother, Klara Hitler. She was gentle, protective, and deeply religious, and her unconditional love became the emotional anchor of his early life. When Klara died painfully of breast cancer in 1907, the young Hitler was devastated. Doctors noted his grief as extreme, almost obsessive. This loss left a psychological scar that never healed. Many historians believe it contributed to his later inability to form healthy adult relationships, replacing emotional intimacy with control, idealization, and domination. As Hitler drifted through Vienna as a failed artist, poor and embittered, women rarely played visible roles in his life. Yet even then, he developed a dangerous pattern. He idealized women as symbols rather than seeing them as individuals. They were either pure, nurturing figures like his mother, or weak, corrupting forces he believed threatened society. This rigid, distorted view would later shape Nazi ideology itself. When Hitler entered politics after World War I, women became crucial to his image, even if they remained hidden from public power. One of the earliest and most influential was his half-niece, Geli Raubal. Young, lively, and emotionally volatile, Geli lived with Hitler in Munich during the late 1920s. Their relationship was intensely controlling. Hitler dictated her movements, her friendships, even her clothing. Friends reported frequent arguments and scenes of emotional cruelty. In 1931, Geli was found dead from a gunshot wound in Hitler's apartment, officially ruled a suicide. The circumstances remain suspicious to this day. Hitler was shattered. He withdrew from public life for days, later calling Geli the only woman I ever loved. After Geli's death, something in Hitler hardened. Those close to him noticed a colder, more ruthless edge. Emotional attachment now became dangerous terrain, something to dominate or suppress. This marked a turning point. From that moment, Hitler kept his private life carefully hidden, while women continued to shape him from the shadows. One of the most consequential figures was Eva Braun. To the German public, she barely existed, yet privately, she was Hitler's constant companion for over a decade. Eva was young, devoted, and painfully aware that she would never be acknowledged. Hitler controlled every aspect of their relationship, forbidding marriage, public appearances, or political involvement. She attempted suicide twice, acts many historians interpret as desperate cries for recognition and agency. Despite her apparent powerlessness, Eva played a psychological role of immense importance. She created an illusion of normality for Hitler, a private world of films, pets, laughter, and domestic calm that insulated him from the horrors he unleashed. While cities burned and millions died, Eva's presence helped Hitler emotionally detach from reality. This detachment was not harmless. It allowed him to pursue catastrophic decisions without confronting their human cost. In this way, comfort became complicity. Beyond personal relationships, women also played strategic roles within the Nazi system. Magda Goebbels, wife of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, was often described as the First Lady of the Third Reich. Intelligent, elegant, and fanatically loyal, She embodied the Nazi ideal of womanhood. Hitler admired her deeply, trusting her judgment and emotional insight. In private conversations, Magda reinforced Hitler's belief that his mission was sacred and that sacrifice, especially by women and children, was noble. Her final act remains one of the darkest symbols of ideological control. In May 1945, inside the same bunker where Hitler spent his last days, Magda poisoned her 6 children before killing herself. She believed a world without National Socialism was not worth living in. This horrifying decision illustrates how deeply Hitler's worldview had penetrated the minds of those closest to power, and how women too became both victims and enforcers of extremist belief. Women were also central to sustaining Nazi society itself. Millions supported Hitler not through formal authority, but through social reinforcement. Female supporters organized welfare programs, raised children indoctrinated in Nazi ideology, and upheld the racial myths that justified genocide. Hitler understood this power. He frequently spoke of women as the guardians of the nation's soul, a role that gave them moral influence even as they were denied political rights. Psychologically, Hitler feared strong, independent women. He avoided intellectual equals and surrounded himself with those who either adored him or reinforced his delusions. This was not accidental. His need for absolute control extended into emotional life. Any woman who challenged him threatened the fragile identity he had built upon grievance, superiority, and destiny. As the war turned against Germany, the influence of women in Hitler's inner circle became more intense, not less. Cut off from reality, Hitler retreated into a bunker world shaped by reassurance and denial. Female secretaries and companions described a man who oscillated between rage and despair, clinging to loyalty as proof that he was still right, still chosen. Their presence helped maintain the illusion that betrayal, not flawed decisions, caused Germany's downfall. The consequences were catastrophic. Hitler's refusal to retreat armies, his insistence on total war, and his rejection of peace negotiations prolonged suffering across Europe. These decisions were not made in isolation. They were reinforced by a closed emotional system where loyalty mattered more than truth, and devotion replaced accountability. In the end, the women around Hitler did not control him in simple or obvious ways. They did not issue orders or command troops. Their influence was quieter, psychological, and deeply human. They comforted, validated, enabled, and sometimes mirrored his obsessions. Some were victims trapped in his orbit. Others embraced his ideology fully. All were part of a system where personal relationships shaped world-altering decisions. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun and then killed himself hours later. It was his final act of control, a private gesture staged amid public ruin. Eva followed him in death, as she had in life. The story of the women who surrounded Hitler forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. History is not shaped by monsters alone, but by ordinary human bonds: love, loyalty, fear, and belief. When devotion replaces conscience and intimacy shields power from accountability, the results can be devastating. This is not merely a story about the past. It is a warning etched into history itself, about how unchecked authority, reinforced by silence and emotional allegiance, can lead humanity into darkness once again. Eva Braun's role in Adolf Hitler's life reveals one of the most disturbing paradoxes of the Third Reich. While Europe descended into fire, genocide, and mass death, the architect of that destru, Kion, carefully preserved a private world of calm, affection, and emotional escape. Eva Braun did not influence military strategy or political ideology directly, yet her presence shaped Hitler's psychological environment in ways that had profound consequences. Through her devotion, silence, and willingness to accept Elizabeth, she helped insulate him from reality, where confrontation with reality ordinary man. This illusion was not harmless. It functioned as a buffer against guilt, doubt, and responsibility. As Hitler consolidated power in the 1930s, Eva's role became more defined. She lived on the margins of his world, often lonely, excluded from official events, and painfully aware that she would never be acknowledged publicly. Her 2 suicide attempts, in 1932 and 1935, reveal the emotional cost of this arrangement. Each attempt was followed by Hitler granting her more attention, a larger residence, or greater comfort, but never legitimacy. These cycles reinforced a pattern of emotional dependency. Eva learned that suffering brought closeness, and Hitler learned that control preserved loyalty. At Hitler's mountain retreat, the Berghof, Eva curated an atmosphere of leisure and normality. She organized film screenings, social gatherings, and quiet domestic routines. Guests later described a strange contrast. Casual conversations, laughter, and tea served on a sunlit terrace, while decisions made in nearby rooms condemned entire cities and populations. Eva did not challenge these decisions. Instead, her role was to ensure that Hitler did not have to emotionally engage with their consequences. This emotional insulation mattered deeply as the war escalated. Hitler increasingly withdrew from advisors who questioned him and surrounded himself with those who reinforced his worldview. Eva's presence contributed to this isolation. She never spoke of the suffering of civilians, the destruction of Europe, or the mass murder of Jews. Whether through ignorance, denial, or ideological alignment, her silence allowed Hitler to maintain a self-image as a misunderstood savior, rather than a perpetrator of unprecedented crimes. Psychologically, this insulation strengthened Hitler's most dangerous traits: his inability to empathize, his refusal to accept failure, and his growing detachment from reality, all intensified during the years Eva remained at his side. As defeats mounted after 1942, Hitler retreated further into fantasy and blame. He accused generals, allies, and entire nations of betrayal, while clinging to personal loyalty as proof of his righteousness. Eva's unwavering devotion became evidence in his mind that he was still right, still worthy, still chosen. In the final months of the war, Eva followed Hitler into the bunker beneath Berlin. This decision was symbolic. She could have fled, survived, and rebuilt a life elsewhere. Instead, she chose proximity to power over survival, loyalty over life. Her presence in the bunker reinforced the closed emotional world Hitler had constructed. Even as Berlin burned and Germany collapsed, Eva decorated rooms, tried on dresses, and spoke of the future as if reality could be held at bay through personal devotion. Their marriage on April 29, 1945, was not an act of love in any ordinary sense. It was a final assertion of control and fantasy. For Hitler, it allowed him to die as a man who had chosen, not been abandoned. For Eva, it was the ultimate recognition she had sought for years, achieved only at the edge of annihilation. Hours later, they were both dead. Eva Braun did not command armies or sign death warrants, yet her role was not insignificant. By helping Hitler emotionally detach from the consequences of his actions, she contributed to a psychological environment where extreme decisions could persist unchecked. Her story illustrates a chilling truth: evil does not always require active cruelty. Sometimes it survives through comfort, silence, and devotion. When power is shielded from reality by those closest to it, destruction can continue long after it should have ended. The death of Klara Hitler in December 1907 marked a silent but decisive turning point in Adolf Hitler's inner life, one whose consequences would echo far beyond his personal grief and into the fate of the world. To understand Hitler's emotional structure, his extreme reactions, and his later obsession with control, one must return to this moment of loss, when the one human bond capable of grounding him was violently severed. Klara Hitler was not merely a mother to Adolf, she was his emotional refuge, by most history. Accounts, she was gentle, attentive, and deeply protective, the opposite of Hitler's harsh, authoritarian father, Alois. In a household marked by fear and discipline, Klara provided unconditional affection. Adolf adored her with an intensity that bordered on dependence. He called her the only being I ever loved, a statement that would gain chilling significance as his life unfolded. Her approval mattered more to him than that of teachers, peers, or authority figures. In her presence, his insecurities softened. Without her, they hardened into resentment. When Klara was diagnosed with breast cancer, Hitler was living in Vienna, struggling as an aspiring artist. He returned home to Linz to care for her during her final months. The treatment, administered by Dr. Eduard Bloch, was brutal and painful, involving repeated applications that left Klara suffering intensely. Hitler witnessed this helplessly. Friends and doctors later recalled his visible distress, his fixation on her pain, and his inability to accept the inevitability of her death. When she finally died at the age of 47, Hitler collapsed in grief. Dr. Bloch later said he had never seen a young man so devastated by the loss of his mother. This was not a normal mourning process. Hitler did not gradually accept the loss, he internalized it. Psychologically, Klara's death reinforced a dangerous pattern already forming within him, the belief that the world was cruel, unjust, and hostile to those he loved. Rather than developing resilience, he developed grievance. The pain did not lead to empathy for others' suffering. Instead, it fueled a sense of personal victimhood that would later expand into collective hatred. After Klara's death, Hitler drifted into isolation. His failure to gain admission to art school coincided with his grief, deepening his sense of rejection. Without his mother's emotional support, he lacked any stabilizing influence. He avoided intimate relationships and replaced human connection with abstraction, ideas, fantasies, and eventually ideology. Love, in his mind, became something that could only exist in idealized, controlled forms. Real human intimacy, with its unpredictability and vulnerability, "Thank you," became threatening. This loss also shaped Hitler's distorted view of women. Klara became an unreachable ideal, pure, self-sacrificing, and endlessly nurturing. No real woman could ever measure up to this image. As a result, Hitler oscillated between idealization and control in his later relationships. Women were either revered symbols or objects to dominate. Emotional equality was impossible. This pattern can be seen clearly in his relationships with Geli Raubal and Eva Braun, where affection was inseparable from control and possession. On a deeper psychological level, Klara's death intensified Hitler's fear of abandonment and loss. He responded by attempting to eliminate vulnerability altogether. Power became a substitute for security. Control replaced trust. As he entered politics, this mindset merged with nationalist resentment. Germany, humiliated after World War I, mirrored his own sense of loss and injustice. Hitler's personal grief fused with collective trauma, transforming private pain into public rage. This fusion had deadly consequences. Hitler's inability to process loss made him incapable of compromise. Retreat, negotiation, or acceptance of defeat felt like emotional annihilation. Just as he could not save his mother, he could not accept limits to his will. This explains his later refusal to retreat armies, his insistence on fighting to the last city, and his willingness to sacrifice millions rather than acknowledge failure. Loss had become intolerable, and reality itself became the enemy. Even Hitler's anti-Semitism was psychologically reinforced by this unresolved grief. Rather than confronting the randomness and cruelty of illness and death, he sought external enemies to blame. Hatred offered structure, where grief offered chaos. Ideology gave meaning to pain. In this way, Klara's death did not create Hitler's evil, but it removed the last emotio, null barrier that might have restrained it. In the end, the shadow of Klara Hitler followed her son into the bunker in Berlin. His final act, suicide amid total collapse, mirrored the emotional logic formed decades earlier. If the world could not conform to his inner vision, it must be destroyed, including himself. The boy who once clung desperately to his mother's bedside grew into a man who could not tolerate loss, uncertainty, or human limitation. The tragedy is not that Adolf Hitler loved his mother deeply. It is that he never learned how to live in a world where love could be lost without turning that loss into hatred, domination, and annihilation. Geli Raubal's presence in Adolf Hitler's life exposed one of the darkest and most revealing chapters of his psychological makeup, a chapter where obsession, control, and emotional instability converged with devastating consequences. Their relationship did not merely reflect Hitler's personality, it intensified it, sharpening traits that would later define his rule over an entire nation. Geli Raubal, Hitler's half-sister, moved into his Munich apartment in the late 1920s, bringing with her her young daughter Geli. Geli was vibrant, expressive, and socially confident. Everything Hitler was not in his youth. At first, he appeared attentive and protective, presenting himself as a guardian figure. But this attention quickly evolved into something far more disturbing. Hitler became intensely possessive, monitoring Geli's movements, reading her letters, and forbidding her from forming romantic relationships. He controlled where she lived, whom she saw, and even her ambitions as a singer. What began as affection hardened into domination. This relationship revealed a critical aspect of Hitler's psychology, his inability to tolerate independence in those he claimed to love. Geli was not allowed to exist as a separate individual. To Hitler, closeness meant ownership. Any hint of autonomy triggered anger, jealousy, and fear of abandonment. Witnesses recalled frequent arguments, emotional outbursts, and moments of humiliation inflicted upon Geli. She reportedly felt trapped, isolated from friends, and desperate to escape his control. The imbalance of power was absolute. Hitler was a rising political figure, admired by followers and feared by opponents. Geli was young, dependent, and socially constrained by his authority. This dynamic mirrored the political worldview Hitler was developing at the same time, a belief that order required submission, that loyalty must be enforced, and that freedom was dangerous if left unchecked. His private life and public ideology were not separate realms, they fed each other. In September 1931, Geli Raubal was found dead in Hitler's apartment, killed by a gunshot wound from Hitler's own pistol. The official ruling was suicide. Yet the circumstances have never been fully resolved. There was no suicide note. She had reportedly made plans to travel. Friends had spoken of her desperation and desire to leave Munich. Whether she took her own life or was driven to it by psychological pressure, the outcome was the same. A young woman's life ended under the weight of Hitler's control. Hitler's reaction was intense and revealing. He withdrew completely from public view for days, collapsing emotionally. He later described Geli as the only woman he had ever truly loved. Yet this declaration exposes a disturbing contradiction. What he called love had been suffocating, coercive, and destructive. In his mind, love did not mean mutual respect, it meant possession. Losing Geli did not lead him to self-reflection or remorse. Instead, it deepened his conviction that emotional attachment was dangerous unless fully controlled. After Geli's death, those close to Hitler observed a noticeable change. He became colder, more rigid, and more emotionally withdrawn. Vulnerability was sealed off. From this point onward, Hitler structured his relationships to eliminate the possibility of emotional loss. Women would be kept at a distance, hidden from public life, and denied influence. This pattern would later define his relationship with Eva Braun, who was allowed closeness only on Hitler's terms and under strict conditions of obedience and silence. The psychological lesson Hitler absorbed from Geli's death was profoundly distorted. Rather than recognizing the harm caused by his domination, he concluded that absolute control was necessary to prevent loss. This logic would later scale catastrophically. Nations, like people, were not to be negotiated with but commanded. Dissent, like independence in Geli, was seen as betrayal. Compassion became weakness, control became survival. The timing of Geli's death is crucial. It occurred just as Hitler was on the brink of national power. In the years that followed, his political behavior reflected the same patterns of obsession and intolerance he had displayed privately. He demanded total loyalty, crushed opposition, and reacted to perceived betrayal with extreme punishment. The emotional blueprint forged in his relationship with Geli became a political strategy. Geli Raubal did not shape Nazi ideology, but she revealed the emotional engine driving it. Her life and death exposed how Hitler's personal pathologies translated into systems of power. The inability to love without controlling, to fear loss without destroying the source of fear, would ultimately define his leadership. In remembering Geli, history confronts an uncomfortable truth. The roots of mass violence are often visible first in private cruelty. Long before Adolf Hitler commanded death camps and armies, he exercised domination over a single vulnerable life. The tragedy is not only that Geli Raubal died young, but that her suffering foreshadowed a world soon to be consumed by the same relentless, unforgiving need for control. As Adolf Hitler's power expanded beyond imagination, a dangerous divide opened between the public reality of destruction and the private world he carefully protected. This private sphere, filled with routine, entertainment, loyalty, and emotional reassurance, became one of the most lethal instruments of his rule. It was not simply a refuge from stress. It was a psychological shield that allowed catastrophic decisions to be made without emotional consequence. The comfort of private life did not soften Hitler. It enabled him. From the moment Hitler became chancellor in 1933, he cultivated two parallel existences. In public, he presented himself as the embodiment of destiny, discipline, and national rebirth. In private, he demanded calm, order, and predictability. He ate simple meals, followed rigid routines, watched films, and avoided scenes of suffering. This separation was deliberate. Hitler did not want reminders of pain, chaos, or doubt entering his personal space. Those reminders threatened the certainty upon which his authority depended. The Berghof, his mountain retreat in Bavaria, became the physical symbol of this insulation. Surrounded by alpine beauty, silence, and carefully selected guests, Hitler experienced a world untouched by bombing raids, hunger, or fear. Decisions of immense consequence were discussed over tea, against panoramic views, in rooms designed to soothe rather than confront. The environment reinforced the illusion that the leader stood above the suffering he caused, untouched by the consequences of his will. Women in his inner circle played a crucial role in maintaining this atmosphere. They were expected to be pleasant, loyal, and emotionally supportive. Conversations about mass death, persecution, or military failure were unwelcome. Instead, there were films, light conversation, and reassurance. This was not ignorance alone, it was an unspoken agreement. Reality was kept outside the door so that Hitler's sense of purpose would remain intact. This emotional insulation had a direct impact on decision-making. As the war expanded and atrocities multiplied, Hitler grew increasingly detached from human consequences. Reports of civilian deaths, starvation, and genocide were abstract numbers, not lived experiences. Because his private world remained calm and orderly, he could continue to believe in his own narrative of righteousness. There was no emotional friction to force reconsideration, no human presence demanding moral reflection. The danger of this comfort became especially clear after 1941, when the war began to turn against Germany. Military setbacks, enormous casualties, and strategic failures mounted. Rather than confronting reality, Hitler retreated further into his private cocoon. He dismissed generals who brought bad news and surrounded himself with those who confirmed his beliefs. Emotional reassurance became more important than accuracy. Loyalty mattered more than truth. This pattern mirrored his personal psychology. Hitler could not tolerate loss, contradiction, or vulnerability. Private comfort acted as anesthesia, numbing the pain of failure. It allowed him to delay decisions, reject compromise, and pursue increasingly destructive strategies. The refusal to retreat armies, the insistence on fighting to the last city, and the order to destroy German infrastructure rather than surrender, all followed this logic. If reality could not be controlled, it would be denied or annihilated. The cost of this denial was immense. Millions died not because alternatives did not exist, but because acknowledging them would shatter the emotional world Hitler depended on. His private comfort required the continuation of fantasy, even as the real world collapsed. The bunker mentality that defined his final months was not a sudden development. It was the ultimate expression of a habit formed over years. Inside the Berlin bunker in 1945, this dynamic reached its extreme. As Soviet forces closed in and Berlin burned, Hitler maintained rituals of normality. Meals were served, conversations continued, and loyalty was affirmed. The outside world no longer existed in any meaningful psychological sense. Comfort had replaced conscience entirely. In this sealed environment, destruction could continue without resistance, and death became preferable to reality. The tragedy of this private world lies in its ordinariness. There was no constant rage, no visible madness, no theatrical cruelty in daily life. Instead, there was routine, politeness, and emotional shelter. This is precisely what made it so dangerous. It demonstrates how immense evil can coexist with calm interiors, how mass suffering can be generated by leaders who feel personally untroubled. History often searches for monsters in moments of visible brutality, yet one of its darkest lessons is that devastation can be sustained by comfort as much as by hatred. When power is wrapped in emotional safety, when leaders are shielded from the consequences of their decisions, destruction becomes easier to justify and harder to stop. Hitler's private comfort did not contradict his public crimes, it sustained them. And in that truth lies a warning that extends far beyond one man or one era. When authority is protected from reality by loyalty, routine, and emotional insulation, the human cost can become limitless. Magda Goebbels stands as one of the most chilling examples of how ideological fanaticism can transform personal devotion into moral annihilation. Elegant, articulate, and deeply committed to National Socialism, she was not merely a bystander to Hitler's regime, but a believer who internalized its worldview so completely that it ultimately consumed her identity, her motherhood, and her humanity. Born Johanna Maria Magdalena Ritschl in 1901, Magda's early life was marked by instability and a restless search for belonging. She moved between cultures, identities, and relationships, absorbing ideas without anchoring herself to any enduring moral framework. This vulnerability made her particularly susceptible to ideologies that promised clarity, purpose, and destiny. When she encountered Adolf Hitler and National Socialism, she found not just a political movement, but a belief system that offered meaning and order in a chaotic world. As the wife of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, Magda occupied a unique position. She was celebrated publicly as the model German woman, refined, loyal, and devoted to family. Privately, she moved within Hitler's inner circle, participating in conversations that reinforced his self-image as a chosen leader, guiding Germany toward historical greatness. Hitler admired her composure and intellect, often referring to her as the embodiment of the ideal Nazi woman. Her approval mattered to him, not politically, but emotionally. Magda's fanaticism was not loud or violent in the conventional sense. It was calm, polished, and absolute. She believed National Socialism was more than a government. It was a moral truth. This belief allowed her to rationalize cruelty as necessity and suffering as sacrifice. In her presence, Hitler encountered not resistance or doubt, but affirmation. She reinforced the idea that loyalty was the highest virtue and that personal pain was irrelevant in the face of ideological destiny. This reinforcement had consequences. Hitler's worldview thrived on emotional validation. Magda provided it with quiet intensity. Her unwavering belief strengthened his conviction that his actions, no matter how destructive, were historically justified. In this way, fanaticism did not merely follow power, it stabilized it. It reduced internal conflict and replaced moral questioning with certainty. The most horrifying expression of Magda Goebbels' ideology came in the final days of the Third Reich. As Berlin fell and the regime collapsed, she followed her husband into the Führer bunker. There, surrounded by concrete walls and the echo of impending defeat, she made a decision that would forever define her place in history. Believing that a world without National Socialism was unworthy of her children, she poisoned all 6 of them as they slept. This act was not committed in panic or madness. By all accounts, it was deliberate and ideologically driven. Magda wrote farewell letters expressing loyalty to Hitler and despair at the future. To her, survival without the Reich meant moral death. In choosing ideology over motherhood, she revealed the ultimate danger of fanatic belief. When abstract ideas outweigh the value of human life, even a parent can become an executioner. Magda's actions illuminate a broader truth about the Nazi system. Extreme ideologies do not sustain themselves solely through fear or force. They endure through emotional commitment, through individuals who willingly sacrifice personal bonds for abstract ideals. Hitler relied on such people. They made his vision feel inevitable and righteous. They transformed his delusions into shared purpose. The psychological symmetry between Hitler and Magda is striking. Both feared chaos, weakness, and loss of meaning. Both sought refuge in absolute belief. Both rejected compromise as betrayal. In this sense, Magda did not merely follow Hitler. She mirrored him. Her devotion reflected the same logic that drove his refusal to surrender, his willingness to destroy Germany rather than accept defeat, and his insistence on ideological purity to the very end. The tragedy of Magda Goebbels is not that she was deceived, it is that she believed, fully, consciously, and without doubt. Her story forces history to confront a disturbing reality. The most catastrophic crimes are often committed not by those who hate blindly, but by those who believe absolutely. In the silence of the bunker, as the Third Reich collapsed into ruin, Magda's final act revealed the true cost of ideological fanaticism. It was the moment when belief extinguished love, when loyalty erased conscience, and when devotion to an idea destroyed the very future it claimed to protect. Her legacy endures as a warning that when ideology becomes sacred and unquestionable, humanity itself becomes expendable. Beyond the visible machinery of terror and repression, the Nazi regime relied on a quieter, more intimate force to sustain itself: emotional enforcement. Women, often excluded from formal political power, became central to maintaining belief, loyalty, and moral justification within German society. Their influence did not operate through commands or laws, but through homes, families, and social expectations, shaping how ideology was felt, normalized, and passed on. In this unseen role, emotional reinforcement became one of the regime's most effective tools. Adolf Hitler understood this dynamic instinctively. He repeatedly described women as the guardians of the nation's soul, assigning them the task of preserving purity, sacrifice, and obedience. This was not praise, but strategy. By framing women as moral anchors rather than decision-makers, the regime ensured that ideology would penetrate everyday life. Belief was not merely taught, it was lived, repeated, and emotionally rewarded within private spaces. In millions of German homes, mothers reinforced Nazi values through routine. Children learned loyalty to the Führer alongside table manners. Stories, songs, and rituals emphasized sacrifice, strength, and racial destiny. These lessons were delivered, not with violence, but with affection. This emotional packaging made ideology harder to question. When belief is associated with love, belonging, and identity, rejecting it feels like betrayal not just of the state, but of family itself. Women's organizations under the Nazi system further formalized this role. Groups such as the National Socialist Women's League promoted obedience, motherhood, and racial duty. They encouraged women to see themselves as active participants in a historic mission, even while denying them autonomy. This contradiction was resolved emotionally. Submission was reframed as honor, and suffering as virtue. Through this lens, endurance became proof of loyalty. Hitler's inner circle reflected the same pattern on a smaller scale. Women close to power were expected to affirm belief, not challenge it. Their task was emotional alignment. Doubt, skepticism, or moral questioning threatened the fragile certainty upon which Hitler depended. Reassurance, admiration, and ideological devotion stabilized his worldview. In this way, emotional loyalty functioned as a form of enforcement, discouraging dissent without the need for coercion. This emotional enforcement extended to the justification of violence. Women were not typically involved in planning mass murder, yet many accepted, rationalized, or ignored it. They absorbed narratives that framed extermination as defense, deportation as necessity, and suffering as regrettable but unavoidable. By accepting these explanations within private life, they helped normalize horror. Silence became a form of participation. The most dangerous aspect of emotional enforcement is its invisibility. Unlike overt brutality, it leaves no obvious trace. It operates through tone, expectation, and shared assumptions. When children saw their mothers admire Hitler's image, when families spoke of sacrifice with pride rather than grief, ideology gained emotional legitimacy. It no longer needed constant force. It lived within people. This dynamic also explains the regime's resilience even as defeat approached. As Germany collapsed, many women continued to encourage endurance rather than surrender. To accept defeat meant admitting that years of belief, sacrifice, and loss had been meaningless. Emotional investment made reality unbearable. In this context, loyalty became a refuge from despair, even as it prolonged suffering. The psychological cost was immense. By tying identity to ideology, the regime ensured that collapse would not merely be political, but existential. For many women, the end of the Third Reich felt like the end of meaning itself. This helps explain acts of despair, denial, and even self-destruction in the final days. When belief replaces conscience, survival without belief can feel impossible. It is essential to recognize that many women were themselves victims of propaganda, social pressure, and a system that denied them agency. Yet victimhood does not erase influence. Emotional power is still power, and when aligned with destructive ideology, it can have devastating effects. The Nazi regime did not function solely because of fear. It endured because belief was emotionally reinforced where people felt safest, at home. This history offers a profound warning. Systems of oppression do not rely only on visible enforcers. They depend on emotional participation, on the quiet acceptance that transforms ideas into identity. When ideology is nurtured through love, loyalty, and belonging, it becomes resistant to evidence and immune to conscience. The tragedy is not only that women were used to sustain a brutal system, but that human emotion itself was weaponized. The lesson endures beyond this era, when belief is protected by emotional comfort rather than challenged by moral reflection. Even ordinary lives can become instruments of extraordinary harm. Adolf Hitler's fear of strong, independent women was not a minor personal preference. It was a defining psychological trait that shaped both his private relationships and his style of rule. He was deeply uncomfortable with women who possessed intellectual autonomy, emotional confidence, or the capacity to challenge him. This fear was rooted in insecurity, not ideology alone, and it explains why he surrounded himself with devotion rather than equality. In Hitler's world, strength in others, especially in women, was experienced as a threat to his fragile sense of control. From an early age, Hitler struggled with authority figures who could not be dominated. His father's harsh discipline had instilled fear, not respect, while his mother's gentle devotion created an emotional ideal that demanded no challenge. As an adult, Hitler sought to recreate this dynamic. He desired admiration without resistance, closeness without accountability. Women who thought independently disrupted this balance. They introduced unpredictability, disagreement, and the possibility of rejection, elements Hitler found intolerable. This pattern is evident in the women he avoided as much as those he chose. Intellectual women, politically engaged women, or women with strong personal ambitions were kept at a distance. Hitler rarely interacted meaningfully with female equals, and when he did, the interactions were brief and carefully controlled. He preferred women who were younger, emotionally dependent, or socially subordinate. This was not accidental. Dependency ensured loyalty, and loyalty reinforced his self-image as indispensable and superior. The contrast between his relationships with women like Geli Raubal and Eva Braun and his avoidance of independent figures is revealing. Geli's desire for autonomy provoked intense control and ultimately catastrophe. Eva Braun, by contrast, survived emotionally by suppressing independence entirely. She did not challenge Hitler's views, question his decisions, or demand recognition. Her compliance made her safe. In Hitler's psychological framework, safety and submission were inseparable. This fear of equals extended beyond gender into politics and governance. Hitler dismissed advisors who questioned him and promoted those who flattered his instincts. Strong personalities, whether male or female, were gradually eliminated from his inner circle unless they demonstrated absolute obedience. Debate was replaced by monologue. Leadership became performance rather than dialogue. The regime increasingly reflected the emotional structure of its leader, rigid, defensive, and hostile to contradiction. In women, however, this fear took on a particular intensity. Independent women represented a collapse of Hitler's idealized gender order, which placed women as nurturers and supporters rather than thinkers or decision-makers. A woman who challenged him not only threatened his authority, but undermined the symbolic world he had constructed, where masculinity equaled command and femininity equaled devotion. Such a challenge could not be tolerated. This dynamic had profound consequences. By excluding strong women from influence, Hitler deprived himself of perspectives that might have introduced restraint, empathy, or realism. Emotional homogeneity replaced diversity of thought. This reinforced his detachment from human consequences. Without voices capable of challenging his worldview, fantasies hardened into policy. Delusion became strategy. The fear of strong women also mirrored Hitler's deeper fear of vulnerability. Equality requires exposure, the possibility of being wrong, of being seen fully. Hitler could not risk this. His identity depended on certainty and superiority. Strong women by their nature reflected back his limitations. Avoiding them was a form of self-protection, but one that came at an enormous cost. As the war progressed and Germany's situation worsened, this avoidance intensified. Hitler retreated further into circles of unquestioning loyalty. The emotional environment around him became increasingly artificial, detached from reality, and hostile to truth. Strength in others, especially moral strength, became indistinguishable from betrayal. In this climate, catastrophic decisions could be made without resistance. The ultimate irony is that Hitler projected weakness onto those he feared. Independent women were labeled dangerous, disruptive, or degenerate, while submission was praised as virtue. In reality, it was Hitler who could not endure challenge. His authority required imbalance. His power depended on silence. This pattern serves as a broader historical warning. Leaders who fear equals surround themselves with mirrors, not minds. They mistake obedience for loyalty and comfort for truth. When strength is excluded and only devotion remains, decision-making collapses into echo. Reality becomes negotiable, and destruction becomes inevitable. Hitler's fear of strong women was not merely personal, it was structural. It shaped the emotional architecture of the Third Reich and contributed to its moral emptiness. In rejecting equality, he rejected restraint. In silencing challenge, he silenced conscience. And in doing so, he revealed a timeless truth. Power that cannot tolerate strength in others is power already afraid of itself. Within Adolf Hitler's inner circle, loyalty gradually replaced truth as the primary currency of survival. And this shift proved fatal not only for Germany, but for millions beyond its borders. What began as political alignment hardened into emotional allegiance, where devotion mattered more than accuracy and reassurance outweighed reality. This transformation did not happen overnight. It emerged from Hitler's psychological need for certainty and control, and it created an environment in which catastrophic decisions could flourish unchecked. From the earliest days of his leadership, Hitler demanded loyalty not merely to the state, but to himself personally. He framed dissent as betrayal and disagreement as weakness. Those who challenged him were not seen as advisors fulfilling their duty, but as enemies undermining a historic mission. This mindset turned leadership into a test of faith. To remain close to power, one had to believe, or at least appear to believe, completely. As Hitler consolidated authority in the 1930s, this culture of loyalty deepened. Skilled individuals who raised concerns were sidelined, while those who echoed Hitler's instincts were promoted. Over time, competence became secondary to obedience. Generals learned that delivering bad news risked humiliation or dismissal. Civil administrators discovered that survival depended on reinforcing the Führer's worldview. Truth became dangerous because it threatened emotional stability at the top. Women within this circle played a subtle but important role in reinforcing this environment. They were expected to affirm, comfort, and reassure, not question or confront. Their presence helped sustain an emotional atmosphere in which Hitler felt validated and secure. In this space, loyalty was not only political but deeply personal. It provided psychological proof that he was right, chosen, and justified, even as evidence mounted to the contrary. This emotional structure had direct strategic consequences. As the war expanded, Hitler increasingly relied on intuition and belief rather than analysis. Reports that contradicted his expectations were dismissed or rewritten. Entire campaigns were shaped by faith in willpower over logistics, ideology over material reality. The invasion of the Soviet Union, the refusal to retreat from Stalingrad, and the insistence on fighting to the end, all reflected this mindset. Loyalty sustained fantasy, truth threatened collapse. The cost of this substitution was immense. Millions of soldiers died because retreats were forbidden. Cities were destroyed because surrender was framed as dishonor. Civilian suffering increased because acknowledging defeat would have shattered the emotional order of loyalty surrounding Hitler. Each decision reinforced the next. To admit error would have exposed the hollowness of absolute devotion. It was easier to demand more sacrifice. As defeat became inevitable, the system tightened rather than corrected itself. Loyalty became more extreme, more performative. Expressions of doubt were treated as treason. In the bunker during the final months, reality existed only as an abstract enemy force outside the walls. Inside, affirmation continued. Those who remained were bound by belief, fear, and emotional dependency. Truth had long since been excluded. This environment did not merely mislead Hitler, it trapped him. Having built a world where loyalty equaled survival, he could no longer distinguish genuine support from coerced affirmation. Surrounded by agreement, he mistook silence for consensus and obedience for conviction. The echo chamber became total. The psychological danger of such a system is that it removes all natural brakes on power. When leaders are insulated from truth by devotion, they lose the capacity for self-correction. Error escalates into catastrophe. Ideology replaces evidence. Reality becomes negotiable until it violently reasserts itself. The collapse of the Third Reich exposed the final consequence of loyalty without truth. As Berlin fell, there were no honest conversations, no moral reckoning, no humane alternatives considered. There was only endurance, sacrifice, and annihilation. Loyalty had devoured reason. This history leaves a stark lesson. Societies do not fall solely because leaders are cruel or incompetent. They fall when truth becomes unwelcome and loyalty becomes absolute. When devotion is valued more than honesty, power loses its connection to reality, and destruction becomes not an accident but an outcome. In Hitler's inner circle, loyalty replaced truth. The world paid the price. As loyalty hardened into doctrine within Adolf Hitler's inner circle, the final barrier between fantasy and catastrophe collapsed. What began as personal allegiance evolved into a system where truth itself became an enemy, and the consequences of that transformation extended far beyond the bunker walls, reshaping Germany's fate and amplifying human suffering on a global scale. This was the point at which error could no longer be corrected, and power became incapable of learning. Once loyalty replaced truth, decision-making ceased to be a rational process. It became an emotional ritual. Advisors no longer asked what was possible, only what would please the Führer. Reports were filtered, softened, or rewritten to avoid provoking his anger. Reality was adjusted to fit belief, rather than belief adapting to reality. This distortion accumulated over time, turning manageable setbacks into irreversible disasters. The German military paid the first and heaviest price. Early in the war, Germany's generals possessed operational flexibility and professional expertise. But as Hitler demanded personal loyalty over strategic honesty, that expertise was systematically silenced. Commanders who warned of overextension or logistical collapse were dismissed or ignored. Those who complied were rewarded. The result was a military structure unable to respond to changing conditions. Retreat became dishonor. Adaptation became betrayal. Nowhere was this more evident than on the Eastern Front. As German forces stalled and suffered massive casualties, accurate assessments were suppressed. Hitler insisted on holding territory at all costs, convinced that willpower could overcome material reality. The encirclement at Stalingrad was not merely a military defeat, it was a psychological one. Officers knew the situation was hopeless, yet loyalty prevented decisive action. Hundreds of thousands died not because the truth was unknown, but because it was unwelcome. The civilian population suffered alongside the soldiers. Loyalty without truth meant that Germany was never prepared for the consequences of total war. Resources were misallocated, cities left undefended, and evacuation delayed. As Allied bombing intensified, propaganda insisted on imminent victory. Civilians were encouraged to endure rather than escape, to sacrifice rather than survive. When collapse came, it was sudden and absolute, leaving millions unprepared for hunger, displacement, and loss. This culture of loyalty also prolonged the Holocaust. As evidence of mass murder mounted, the absence of moral challenge within Hitler's circle ensured that extermination continued unchecked. There was no space for ethical resistance, no forum for dissent. Bureaucrats carried out orders efficiently, reassured by the silence above them. Loyalty shielded perpetrators from reflection, allowing genocide to proceed as routine administration. Internationally, the effects were devastating. Hitler's refusal to negotiate or acknowledge defeat extended the war far beyond necessity. Opportunities for earlier surrender were rejected because they contradicted the emotional narrative of destiny and betrayal. Entire regions were destroyed in the final months of fighting, not for strategic gain, but to preserve the illusion of resolve. Cities were reduced to rubble to avoid admitting reality. As Germany collapsed, loyalty without truth turned inward. Hitler ordered the destruction of German infrastructure, believing the nation had failed him and deserved to perish. This was the final expression of a worldview untethered from responsibility. When leaders are surrounded only by affirmation, they cease to see the people they govern as human beings. They become instruments of belief rather than lives to be protected. The human cost of this system cannot be overstated. Millions died because correction was impossible. Families were destroyed because honesty was dangerous. A nation was dragged into ruin because truth had no place at the table of power. Loyalty did not save Germany, it condemned it. In the final days, as Berlin burned and the regime collapsed, loyalty offered no protection. Those who had affirmed Hitler to the end were left with silence, rubble, and loss. The illusion dissolved instantly, revealing the emptiness beneath it. Truth, long suppressed, returned violently. This is the enduring lesson of Hitler's inner circle. Power that demands loyalty without truth becomes blind. Blind power does not merely fail, it destroys. When leaders are insulated from reality by devotion, when honesty is treated as treason, catastrophe becomes inevitable. History does not end this lesson in 1945. It repeats it wherever allegiance replaces accountability and belief replaces evidence. The tragedy of Nazi Germany stands as a warning written in ruins. A system that fears truth will eventually be consumed by it, and the price will always be paid by those with the least power to escape. The story of Adolf Hitler and the women who surrounded him ultimately leads beyond one man, one regime, and one era. It points toward a universal warning about power, ideology, and human nature, one that remains unsettling precisely because it is not unique. The catastrophe of the Third Reich was not driven by madness alone, nor by cruelty in isolation. It was driven by ordinary human weaknesses magnified by unchecked power, the hunger for certainty, the comfort of belief, and the fear of questioning what gives life meaning. At the core of Hitler's rise was an emotional transaction. He offered purpose to those who felt humiliated, lost, or afraid, and in return he demanded loyalty that replaced moral judgment. Women in his life, and in German society more broadly, were drawn into this exchange not simply as victims, but as emotional participants. They were asked to nurture belief, to soften doubt, and to make sacrifice feel virtuous. In doing so, they helped transform ideology into identity. Once belief becomes identity, questioning it feels like self-destruction. This is where human nature reveals its most dangerous vulnerability. People do not cling to destructive systems only because they fear punishment. They cling because those systems give their suffering meaning. Hitler understood this instinctively. He framed loss as sacrifice, cruelty as necessity, and obedience as honor. When reality contradicted these narratives, it was reality that had to be rejected. Truth became unbearable because it threatened the emotional structure holding everything together. Power thrives in this environment. Leaders who are insulated by devotion lose contact with consequence. Surrounded by reassurance, they mistake loyalty for righteousness and silence for agreement. This was not unique to Hitler's bunker. It is a pattern seen whenever authority becomes unquestionable and belief becomes sacred. The private comfort of those in power grows as the public cost of their decisions escalates. The women closest to Hitler did not create his ideology, but they illustrate how human bonds can protect destructive ideas from collapse. Love without accountability, loyalty without conscience, and belief without empathy become shields behind which harm can continue. These dynamics are not confined to history books. They exist wherever people choose emotional safety over moral responsibility. The most chilling aspect of this history is its ordinariness. There was no single moment when millions consciously chose evil. Instead, there were small acts of acceptance, silence, justification, and emotional alignment. Mothers taught children songs before teaching them questions. Companions offered comfort instead of challenge. Citizens chose belonging over truth. Step by step, the extraordinary became normal. This reveals the true danger of ideology. It does not announce itself as inhuman. It presents itself as protective, meaningful, and righteous. It promises clarity in a confusing world. But once ideology demands loyalty above humanity, it begins to hollow out conscience. When belief becomes more important than life, destruction follows naturally. Hitler's downfall did not come from sudden moral awakening. It came from reality forcing its way back in, through rubble, death, and defeat. By then, the cost was irreversible. The emotional structures that sustained his power could not survive contact with truth, and when they collapsed, the why took everything with them. This is the warning history offers. Power that cannot be questioned will eventually destroy itself and others. Ideology that cannot tolerate doubt will demand sacrifice without limit. Human beings who surrender moral judgment in exchange for belonging become instruments of harm, even when they believe they are doing good. The lesson is not that people are inherently evil, but that they are vulnerable. Vulnerable to certainty, to authority, to narratives that turn fear into purpose. The responsibility of every generation is to resist that vulnerability, to protect truth, to value empathy, and to accept uncertainty rather than escape into absolutes. In the end, the women who surrounded Hitler, the men who served him, and the millions who followed him remind us of a single enduring truth. The greatest danger is not hatred alone, but belief without conscience. When power is fed by unquestioned loyalty and insulated by emotional comfort, history does not merely repeat itself,